Hi, everyone. I hope you're having a fantastic week. Excited to be talking to you guys today. So, while everyone checks in and signing in and making sure that the platform, the distribution is working from all the different platforms, wanted to talk a little bit about what we're going to be doing today. Today's going to be a special episode in a way because it's the first time I'm going to have essentially an unstructured conversation with a guest. All of the episodes we've done so far have been a lesson to be learned and with a very, very specific topic. But in this case, we're going to be talking to a good friend of mine who's someone I also really respect and admire. And I read his book this year, and I thought it was so compelling that I thought it would lead to a fun and interesting conversation, but not just around the book that he wrote, but also around life in general, life decisions, the path of entrepreneurship, reinventing yourself, and many, many, many other topics. So let's see how things are going. Okay, seems that things are going well, so we'll get going. Welcome to Playing the Unicorns, episode 11. This week we're going to be discussing Loonshots with Safi Bahcall. So I rarely recommend business books, and the reason is I think most of them, frankly, or have one core idea that is rather simple, and they're not that interesting, they're not that compelling. But this year I came around a book that I think is a rare breed that is actually covers history, covers physics, it has insights, it has personal narratives of people that I think and I consider to be heroes of mine, and it's probably not only the most compelling business book I've read perhaps ever, but maybe the most compelling book I've read in 2020. And it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend Safi Bahcall, the author of the book, who can actually tell us about his journey. And but before we get going, maybe Safi, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Fabrice. And first, let me just say I'm honored to be your first guest, first non-practical lesson guest. So I will, I guess we'll try to guarantee this is impractical. Is that the objective? But also thanks for those words. I think, maybe my publisher would want to quote you, the most compelling business book ever. But I appreciate that. I'm delighted to be here. I actually don't know how much you mentioned wherever, but you and I met maybe a decade ago, and when we were both single guys, and I remember discussing with you the optimal strategies for finding a life partner. Actually, this is probably more than a decade ago.
Oh no, I think we've known each other for 20 years. I mean, we've been in the same social,
Wow.
frankly, intellectual circles for so long. And we met before Dialogue, and the first Dialogue was 2006. And so, no, it's been
Yes.
quite the journey.
Wow. Time flies. That's right. Yeah. No, I remember because that really stood out. I was like, this guy thinks a little differently. Because yeah, I remember we were talking about finding a life partner and how do you go about that. And in fact, Orrin Hoffman I talked about that with Orrin Hoffman
Yeah.
also in the early days. Tim Ferriss also in the early days. Kind of, it was a subject of conversation when you're in your early 30s or whatever. And I remember you like immediately pulled out a list of like 28 criteria that were really specific about must play this video game, but not that video game. I'm like, wow, this person's really thought about this. And anyway, so we've been kind of friends ever since. So I've enjoyed that. My own background, I was a theoretical physicist in academia until I was about 30. And then it caused a major, tragic, disruptive event in my family when I left the Church of Academia, broke the religion, broke the faith, and wandered off into the business world. Little time at a management consulting firm, McKinsey in New York, which is sort of like a halfway house before they let academics loose into the real world. They're like, let's just make sure he doesn't drool in public, what the word team means, that sort of stuff. And they kind of train you to be basically normal and get a lot of the academic habits out of your
Were
head.
we at McKinsey at the same time?
When were you there?
I was there in 96, 98, and it was exactly that. Like, I came out at Princeton and I was really still like not socially well versed, and so it was like more like understand how to interact with human beings as opposed to be a social introvert.
Yeah, that's pretty much what it's to take these. There's a standard group that comes from business school that, have already figured that out. And then there's, folks like us who are either PhDs or MDs or advanced degrees. And they're like, let's explain how human interactions work. Okay. Now you can solve differential equations, but human stuff, just a little bit different.
Yeah, no, I needed to
Uh,
download the modules for empathy and emotional intelligence and team building.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that was the way I ended up being in charge of recruiting people from, I was in around, I think it was 9801 or something in New York. I ended up being in charge of recruiting people, helping people transition from a PhD academic world to, to the business world. It's a little digression, but there, I think it may be relevant for, I think you said your audience, there are a lot of engineers and technical folks who move into the business world. So there were two kind of mental models that I found was useful in talking to people about it. One is speed chess versus real chess. In the academic world, you essentially have infinite time and limited resources. That's sort of like, in chess, you have infinite time. Normal chess, you have infinite time for a move. But in the business world, it's the inverse. You have relatively infinite resources compared to academia, but limited time to make a decision. So now you're playing speed chess. So it's actually a different game, and there are different rules. You're not working to optimize originality or your resume or creativity. You're optimizing to get to a solution and an answer fast. So that was speed chess versus regular chess was useful in making that transition. But also, um, the way I thought about it was, I was studying theoretical physics, and it's like going to the gym and exercising your left bicep for 25 years. You have one of the possibly best left biceps on the planet. But all the other stuff about like working with people and, learning how to solve problems quickly and approximately, a little
I
flabby.
don't know. I was
And
Sheldon.
so,
I was literally Sheldon. Same thing. I could do math with the best of them, but like actually interacting with people, it was beyond me. It was like so hard and complex that I kept doing the thing I was really good at because of course it came naturally.
yeah. In the end, I found I actually really I played a fair amount of competitive sports growing up.
Mm.
And so working with people, working with teams, I actually love that. It's like firing up a team and getting them all excited about a big goal. And especially when you care about that goal. I transitioned into biotech after a couple of years at McKinsey, I left and started a biotech company developing drugs for cancer. And so I was in the end really passionate about that goal and really excited about the mission of that goal. And it kind of takes you out of yourself because certainly for the first 30 some years of my life, it was mostly about um, your originality, your ideas, your ability to solve problems or your career. In academia, it's about your track record of important papers, which is really about originality and creativity and solving difficult problems. In the business world is, can you get X done? Can you, if you're an advisor, how successful are you at advice? But once you're uh, involved in something like developing new drugs for patients who are dying, and you start to meet with those patients, and I remember the first time I went to a hospital and sat next to a patient at their bed, and they didn't know anything about and didn't care about, contracts or employment agreements or stock options or revenue project. They just wanted to not die. And then suddenly a lot of things sort of
Yeah.
get clear. Like this is why you're here, and the other stuff is a means to the end, but this really is the end.
And it
And
totally
it's an end that makes you,
crystallizes priorities.
yeah, and it kind of makes you feel selfishly. It makes you feel good.
Yeah.
You're like, you know what? Yeah, I can deal with all the company building stuff and financing stuff and business strategy stuff and work, hiring and resolving issues. But at the end, all of those are a means to an end. They're not the end
Of
themselves.
course.
And so, yeah, I started the company. It was about 2001 or so, and ran it for 6 or 7 years as a private company, went public, and then another 6 or 7 years as a public company. And now I'm here talking to you.
So how did that transition happen? How does one go from being a public company CEO, entrepreneur, founder to being I don't know. I don't know actually. What are you today? Do you define yourself as a writer, as an intellectual, as something else?
Good God, I hope I don't define myself as an intellectual. I don't even know what that means. What's not an intellectual? Like you actively don't think. Here's my. So what does it mean to say you're an intellectual? I think. How profound is that? It's like I
well,
breathe. I'm a
well,
breather.
the thing is, you're absolutely right from that perspective. But like in France, there's this concept of the public intellectual that is this revered title that a few people like Sartre had, or Camus, or Bernard Henri Lévy. And in the U.S., there's no really that equivalent. Though I think you have a number of writers who are deemed to be more thoughtful that perhaps have reached kind of that. And I don't know if it maybe Malcolm Gladwell or maybe Neil Ferguson or Fareed Zakaria might fall in that category, though. Are they really that public relative to the level of fame that an intellectual can have in France? I'm not so sure, but
I guess I don't quite. I see how you think, but that to me that's thinking about it as what you are.
yeah,
And I just don't think about it that way. I think
okay,
about it as what I do and what I enjoy doing. And so what
yeah.
I enjoy doing is solving big problems, difficult problems, seeing them in kind of a fresh way that can help people with some big goals. And that's fun for me and that's exciting for me. And it's kind of about solving really interesting puzzles and problems and seeing the world in a new way. And those problems can be problems is a big umbrella. So you have a tough business problem, a strategy problem. You have a tough intellectual problem, like why market crash. For example, and efficient markets aren't supposed to crash, yet they always crash, and that's kind of an interesting puzzle. Or you see these mysteries in the world, like why do you consistently see these behaviors, whether it's physical behavior or behavior of companies, and how can you understand that better, and what fresh insights can you get, or helping people with their problems. Um, so I guess I more think of myself as what I spend my time on, and I spend my time on solving problems that are really interesting and working with people uh, whose goals I'm pretty excited about and helping them get to their goals
So you're
better.
so you're
So
a problem solver,
yeah,
and I guess it expresses itself in a number of, I guess, outcomes. Maybe as a consultant, it sounds like for some people, as a author or writer in some cases, and as a researcher probably in other cases.
yeah. So I mean, I'll give you an example. The quite a few folks, not only in the private sector, especially entrepreneurs, where they've hit product market fit and they're scaling, and they've gone from 10 company or 50 person company, 100 person company. Now they're getting to 1,000 or a few thousand, and they're either already public or making the transition, and your job changes. And since I've been there, and I'm not a venture capitalist, I'm not a board member, I'm not their boss, I'm not evaluating them. I kind of enjoy being on the side and helping them with the guaranteed condition I'll never talk to your board. I'm just there to be the kind of guy I wished I'd had, that I could lean on when I was going through some of those changes.
Actually, that's the type of role
Um,
we actually hire a number of trusted experienced advisors for some of our CEOs actually as they scale and they're going through these transitions of like from 50 employees to 150 employees, and you're right, they don't actually talk to us. They're purely there to help the CEO and the founder deal with the issues that they're facing. So I think it's extremely valuable and probably undervalued by most.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example. Let's say you're in that position. When you're 10 or 20 people, your job is the how. How are we going to get this project done? How are we going to get this task done? How are we going to ship this project? Then you get a little bigger. Let's say you have some success. It's okay. What's next? The job shifts from how to what, and then you grow, and the job shifts to who. Well, who is right for this role, and how am I going to resolve, the who is doing this and who is doing that. So it shifts sort of how to what to really a people and prioritization job. And let's say you're a CEO and you've passed that mark, 100 or a few hundred people, and thinking about, is my CFO the right guy? He just told me this thing and it's kind of like rubbed me the wrong way. And like, I really have a lot of questions about what he said. It seems kind of pretty ridiculous. And suppose you tell your board, like, I don't know about the CFO. And then you discover 3 days later that you totally misunderstood what he said, the CFO or she. Now, what do? You obviously can't talk about it with your executive team because you're talking about one of them. You say, oh, am I thinking of replacing him? Now, you just talked to one of your board members about your concerns. Do you go back and say, I was a total idiot. I misunderstood? Maybe you do, but now you look like a total idiot. And the next time you say this, you have a lot less credibility. Or do you not go back to the board? The point is that there's sometimes you have ideas that are not fleshed out that you want a safe space to discuss them, and your spouse or life partner is probably tired of hearing about it. So it is useful to have somebody who's kind of been there. And I think there is a gap, kind of like you say, because venture capitalists are in the business. I know you mentioned you have a lot of VC listeners. They're in the business of generating liquidity. That's what they're paid for by their limited partners. And so their goal is to, get public and get out. Once, it's not a bad thing. They're doing what they're paid for, their fiduciary responsibility. They're not being paid to hold on to liquid assets. That's what the limited partner can decide for himself or herself. So they already have a different agenda than a CEO or a management team, which is looking longer term, which, everybody knows. I really want to bring in McKinsey. No offense, but if you and I have both been there, but you're you're a 1,000-person company or a few thousand-person company. You're not, Ford Motors or General Electric. So there is a little bit of a gap. You want someone to talk to who you can really lean on, but who's not a board member, who's not an executive team, and your pals will do you a favor. They go out to lunch and beers with you, but they're only there sort of part-time. So yeah, there's
So how many
I
consulting
do
gigs do you
enjoy
have at
doing
any
that.
point in time? Is that compensated in equity and cash, or to the extent you're comfortable talking about it?
Yeah, I get a dozen calls a week to either speak or work with companies or whatever. And so I ended up creating a rule that I do no more than 5 at a time because I have other commitments and other projects. And I don't want to build a consulting firm. So I do it only when, A, there's really good chemistry. I just like the person and want to be on the phone with them a couple times a month. Um, B, I think I can make a difference. If I don't think I can make a difference, they're being well advised, they know what they're doing, then it's just a waste of my time and their time. And C, I care about what they're doing. And so when those 3 conditions hit, and I have, a kind of an available slot, I'll do it. Otherwise, I've got other things to do, and so that's part time. And then I do that. There's uh, a lot of a number of folks in the national security community, military and intelligence community reached out because what I wrote about in
Absolutely.
Loonshots is kind of some fresh insights on how you can design organizations to innovate faster and better, and where companies and especially larger organizations typically go wrong, and some kind of practical things that you can do, which is not really related to the 10,000 business books written on touchy feely stuff, culture. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's important. But you can read a BuzzFeed article or a HBR article or any of a number of good books on here's the 10 things you should do and get coaching on that and so forth. But this is more about structural and organization design. And there's some stuff in the book, and actually over the last couple of years working with the military and some really interesting companies, a few things not in the book about things that executive teams can do to kind of create in a more sustainable way, a much higher pace of innovation.
So why don't we
Um,
actually delve deeper a little bit on that right now? So how did the idea for the book come about, and then how did you go about getting it done? And then we can talk about what the ideas are in there and whether or not we're actually succeeding as a country or as the military in terms of doing these things. Because when I look at projects like the Joint Strike, Strike Fighter, which takes so much money and so many years, are our procurement systems really working to getting us the best idea? And we see it at NASA, right? Like SpaceX is doing obviously building on the shoulders of the people that came before, but much quicker and much cheaper. What NASA and frankly Lockheed and Boeing, et cetera, have been doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've actually been part of this really interesting class at Stanford, Technology, Innovation, and Modern Warfare. Got to know the instructors there, Steve Blank, who created the Hacking for Defense program, Joe Felter, Raj Shah, who ran the DIU program for the DoD. And so that's the subject of the class. And I think I'll come back to I think you asked me about how I got started in writing. I'll come back to that. But since you mentioned the military stuff, I think people don't appreciate the level to which this is an urgent threat, the level to which what worked for the last 70 years since World War II is no longer going to work. We have essentially started each conflict over the last 70 or 100 years behind our adversaries, either in technology or in strategy. In World War II, we started behind Nazi Germany, which was first with jet engines and the U-boats that would have turned the course of the war had we not made some pretty important changes at the last minute. Same with many subsequent conflicts. And what we did is catch up in time. We said, oh, whoops, these U-boats are sinking all of our ships in the Atlantic. We better figure this out. And we didn't for 3 or 4 years and almost lost. And then figured it out just kind of in the nick of time. And the problem is that model is fine. It works. We were able to win most of our conflicts when the pace of innovation is about hardware. Because building a new type of U-boat or building a new type of tank or building a new type of plane takes some, and the adversary can't really respond in time. So the pace of innovation is kind of the pace of change of hardware. As I'm sure all your audience members know, we've shifted to where the kind of source of competitive advantage, whether it's on a battlefield or in private sector market, is turning to software and data. Now, the pace of innovation of an algorithm is much faster than a tank or a product. And that means that you can't afford to innovate at kind of the slow pace that we have done before. The model of organizations that we had over the last 70 years, where you have, one force that's focused on the franchises on time, on budget, on spec consistently to customers with quality, your sales, your development, your manufacturing, and another which is just an R&D lab, and they're more or less disconnected. That model isn't going to work very more. That model has a lot of friction because those two groups don't understand each other and generally don't like each other. The group that's making the money rarely likes the group that's spending the money, and vice versa.
Frankly, I'm not even sure it worked that well when you think of in the corporate world with like Bell Labs, right? Like Bell Labs, they had the company making them all the money, and then they had all this amazing research coming out of it. And I don't know if it actually ever worked there, or if it's just at the end the creative geniuses were no longer respected, but all their top products seem to have gone to Steve Jobs and Bill Gates as opposed to coming out for their own perspective. So I'm not even sure that R&D lab on the side, doing its own thing actually kind of ever worked that well.
Right. The vast majority of the time it failed. And Bell Labs is a special case because they were government regulated, so they're actually not allowed to commercialize a whole bunch of their technologies.
Okay.
Which is why many of them, they had to give away the transistor, for example, for free as part of their agreement to have a monopoly on the phone business. But many, many, many other examples of that sort of stuff failing. And it's like the military over the last 70 years. It didn't work very well, but it worked well enough. It was okay because nobody was much better. That is no longer the case. For example, not many people realize that in the last 5 years or 7 years in military war games against China, the U.S. has a perfect record. We lose 100 out of 100 times. And that's new. China has studied carefully what we've done. You can read about this in a number of, actually pretty good reports. The National Security Commission on AI is a good one. Christian Bros's book, who used to run the U.S. Armed Services Committee, was a staff director for that and worked for McCain, and he wrote a very good summary of that. China has studied what happened to us, which is that we essentially, like many large organizations, got pretty complacent because we were the only superpower game in town, realistically. So we kept doing the stuff that worked, just like militaries do that, just like what happened just before World War II, where everybody said, all we need are guns and bayonets. Really? This submarine thing and this jet engine thing and this, aircraft thing, that's not going to be important? No, guns and bayonets. So that's a very common trap, and it's related to having this kind of older model. And so that's why I've actually spent time not only with national security, where there's a real urgent threat because the world has changed, but also larger private sector companies. Just as an example, IBM used to be a superpower. I mean, people who are a little younger than us don't remember, but IBM was like the United States. It was the industry was called the IT industry was called IBM and the Seven Dwarfs because their revenues was bigger than its next seven competitors combined. And then it lost its superpower status. And that's a little bit where the United States is today. We're used to, for 7 decades, being the only superpower game in town, and that's no longer the case. And so we need to make some changes. So that's, as an example, that's one of the things I spend some fair amount of time in, which is how do you transition an extremely large organization to a different model where you can overcome the internal barriers to innovation, not just fight the external battles.
Can you summarize in like a few sentences what do you think that cultural or how you make that transition? I mean, you gave a few advice, like, love your canons as much as you love your creative genius, etc. But like, maybe practically, like you're the U.S. military, or frankly, if you're a government, or if you're Google, how do you do it?
Actually, some of the ideas sort of come from Google. So, for example, when I was maybe last year sitting on a nuclear submarine with an admiral who was responsible for transforming the U.S. Navy for the 21st century, and he said, "Listen, we need to transform all of these systems that are pretty old and out of date. And that's one of the reasons China is, a much more urgent threat. They have understood that we have all these old systems and have not been able to really modernize them. And China is coming up as an upstart without that legacy burden and is able to attack vulnerabilities there. So he said, how do we transform? And I talked to him about Google. A friend of mine there was, in charge of transitioning the back end of the Google search engine, which, a year or two ago was 15, 20 years old, built on some old back end, and they need to transition it to a much more modern. That's a big project. And Google is doing it in, 6-month blocks. And he said that kind of thing would take us 6 years or 60 years. So how does Google do it in 6 months? So, there's obviously a lot more to it, but I'll tell you one thing that you can read about. I wrote about it in an article on War on the Rocks. And that is we need to stand up a new functional combatant command, like Special Operations or JSOC. Not to fight the external battles, but the internal battles, because the real problem is that good teams will kill great ideas. So how do you prevent this problem? How do you solve this problem? The answer is not another innovation lab. The DoD has 76 innovation labs, just like IBM has hundreds of innovation labs, and it doesn't make any difference if good teams will keep killing ideas. So one of the things we need is a special forces, not of scientists with ideas and entrepreneurs with ideas. Those are actually the worst at getting something done inside a large company. People think, oh, let's bring in a bunch of entrepreneurs or open an office in Silicon Valley. Actually, those are the worst people to help you drive innovation inside your larger organization. Why? Because they don't understand, and not only that, they don't respect or care about the unusual and weird levers you need to pull to get stuff to happen. That's not what, if you're running a 10-person company and all this stuff is about, here's what it takes to succeed as an entrepreneur, that's interesting, but that has nothing to do with how do you transform a much larger organization. There are all sorts of internal, incentive issues, agenda issues, and how do you make that work? How do you optimize, what's an engineer might call a large end problem to move this whole system in a new way? And entrepreneurs don't care about that problem. And
Yeah, no,
that's why
I think they can't be bothered with bureaucracy, and which I think, and you give examples in the book, and many of them they keep doing these. You call them P-type innovations, but they actually never build franchises. And so if you don't build
Right.
a franchise, then you're vulnerable to other types of disruption. I think you give the example of what happened in Pan Am, frankly, what happened to Polaroid, which were like
Yeah.
kept innovating and innovating and innovating until the market kind of moved away from them.
Yeah, that's an example of a typical entrepreneur trap who focuses just on product and misses the small changes in strategy that aren't as glamorous and
Yeah.
aren't shiny and won't make the cover
But
page of a
but
magazine,
if I
but are
look
very
at
important.
No, I'm sorry. If I look at Google, I mean, they clearly have franchises, right? They have search, they have AdWords and AdSense, they have YouTube, but their own innovation doesn't seem to be working particularly well. I mean, it doesn't feel like they've actually built new franchises. I mean, Android they acquired, YouTube they acquired, they search they built, and everything else they've tried since then. And I'm not sure to what extent is actually worked even within Google.
It's very tough to sit at the outside and kind of very easy to sort of say that.
It's a
I'm
question, by
not.
the way. I'm not. It's not a statement.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
an
No,
observation. Yeah.
yeah. No, I think there's a lot of not you, but other, not just you, in other words, but a lot of people raise those kinds of uh, questions, and sometimes it's very difficult. For example, there can be a really big change. It's pretty radical, reflection of how you do stuff, and you just don't see it. Or the kind of many pretty interesting ideas that I've seen that are baking inside of Google when you go under the hood and and you visit there. Um, and some of them really are getting traction. If you look at the companies that they've spun out, whether it's Waymo or their life sciences, the Google Glass actually is a great example of they are trying something radical. It didn't work. It got a little overkilled because of some of the publicity, but it actually has some very useful industrial applications and has led to some useful stuff. So I'm not. I think you asked kind of what are some of the specific things that you could do inside very large organizations. One of the things that is not very well appreciated is the need essentially for professional mediators between these two groups. And the way you can think about it is if you kind of the classic model of an organization, yeah, let's just create an R&D lab. Also, we have these guys who are the soldiers who are selling on time, on budget, on spec. And, if there's any problem, it sort of gets escalated to the CEO's desk. That's sort of like building a car and saying, well, let's put on wheels. They'll move really quickly. And also we'll have pistons that fire kind of on time. But don't worry about the oil. They'll just get along. What you have is a car that can move very slowly and with a lot of friction and will heat up and will break often. So essentially what you want in a different model is a professional group of politically neutral mediators. And there's a few companies that have sort of figured that out and do that well. But the key is that they don't report into the R&D lab. They don't report into the sales force. They have a separate independent line. And because of that, they're Switzerland. And because of that, you create the incentive
So what would the
to
title
solve
be of the head of that? And they'd report, I guess, to the CEO directly.
they can report to the CEO or someone on the executive team who's neither the head of R&D nor the head of operations, who reports into the CEO. Either way, actually, there isn't a terrific word. Actually, different companies use different words for that. The most confusing word is to call them program managers, because in the tech world, in Silicon Valley, that suggests, a kid with a clipboard watching a budget.
Yeah.
But that's not their job. What they really are is program champions. And their job is to get the program to succeed by mediating between the innovator, technology, engineer, scientist person, and the person who gets it to customers and has to sell it. And they have different objectives and different incentives. So you kind of learn that it comes. I certainly saw it working in practice in the biotech pharma industry because Biologists are not very good at necessarily, they're not trained at selling their ideas internally. So the need for this comes from this false understanding or false myth that the person who is the inventor of an idea should also be its champion. And that's kind of an implicit assumption inside of large organizations. If you have an idea, go and sell it. But usually, actually, the person who comes up with the idea doesn't really understand how to sell it because those are two totally different skill sets. If you play trombone, it doesn't make you a good baseball player, and vice versa. As an example, I mentioned the story in the book. Radar was discovered and invented by a couple of really bright scientists in the Office of Naval Research in the early 1920s, 10 or 15 years before it got rediscovered in the UK. But it sat there buried because while they were good inventors, they were lousy champions.
So what title did?
And it stayed
I'm
buried.
sorry. What title did Bush have then? Because he was answering, if I remember directly, to the president. Therefore, he could be independent and kind of force both the geniuses and the military to like butt heads and like make it happen.
Yeah, he was essentially the head of. He created these sort of internal program champions and played that role. But at the end of his career, he recognized, hey, this is what's missing long term. We really need these kind of independent professionals who are really the oil of our engine. We've got lots of great R&D labs. Those are the wheels. We've got great soldiers. Those are the pistons. But we keep making the mistake of assigning the connection between those two to like high school kids with clipboards who have no respect, get little respect internally in the organization. So it's as if they're not there. When you call them a tech liaison or whatever, nobody cares. They just get ignored, and then the innovations die in the middle.
And if you call them an evangelist, is it too biased? It's not considered to be enough independent?
Evangelist is a little religious, and it's a little Silicon Valley-esque for the rest of the United States, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I know. You make a good point.
In the rest of the, in biotech, in pharma, you can call them program champions. And the point is that the executive team needs to elevate their role. In Google, let's say they have a career ladder of program managers. And, one friend of mine there who kind of is pretty senior up in that career ladder said, my superpower is I know how to influence nerds. Speak to them. You have to be bilingual. You have to speak both languages. What will business people get and understand? Their focus is on, I need to make 15 sales calls an hour to get 3 closed leads to get 1 closed deal. Every hour you're yapping to me about your crazy new idea or project or your 87-page PowerPoint on why this thing will be great is an hour I'm not making 15 calls. That's money out of my pocket. So you need to now understand the incentives on both sides, speak both of their language, know what will resonate, understand horizontal influence. And that's a special forces with a special skill set that needs to be trained and needs to have a career.
I could argue that biotech hasn't figured it out. Like if I look at pharma, they seem to just buy the biotech companies, right? So they, in a way, they can't do it internally. So because they haven't figured it out internally, they just go in and do M&A.
It is true that they do. This is sort of a quantitative question, not a. It is true that pharma buys a lot of biotech. It is true that some pharma have strongly reduced their internal R&D budgets, but not to zero. Yeah. Novartis has a terrific internal R&D organization here in Cambridge called the Novartis Institute of Research. Sometimes they license stuff externally to develop internally, and sometimes they do it on their own. So it's a portfolio, and I think almost all of the better companies have figured out a portfolio balance of investing internally versus acquiring externally, and they just manage that portfolio. There's a few that set their internal portfolios to zero, but not many.
But by the way, I'm shocked that China can do this well, right? Like China is super top down, extremely political. If you're well connected, your ideas might get better push than others, and so I'm surprised that they can find these independent program managers who can play the role between the military with a clear objective and the tech creatives. And I mean, and is it really that sustainable? Because it doesn't feel like a top-down approach will ultimately be successful. It feels like they have a bureaucracy that would not ultimately lead to success.
Well, what you do, not to get too into the weeds on this, but what you do when you create kind of a special forces that's politically neutral, you have to get it right. If you do it wrong, it won't work. But if you do it right, you have a career ladder
Mm.
of these folks who are bilingual translators. And you can think of them like, actually, when I was on a submarine, I explained it. You have an airlock. Okay, you need to depressurize the technology solution and translate it into language that a business person can see why it will make them money. And then when they give the feedback, you have to take that feedback and translate it back into language that the technologist will get about why they need to and should make these dumb changes that this, sales guy who doesn't understand anything about technology um, should do. And that, you can think of it, I like to think of it as sort of the beautiful baby problem. A technologist or an engineer or um, a biologist in the lab likes to see their new ideas, this beautiful baby full of potential. They're very sensitive to criticism about that beautiful
Yeah.
baby. Now, the soldier sees a shriveled up raisin covered in vomit and poop. And that's kind of the essence of it. Beautiful baby, vomit, and poop. And they're both right, right? The beautiful new ideas have a lot of potential, but they have a lot of flaws. And the soldier is really looking at the flaws, and the originator, the inventor, is really looking at the potential, at the beautiful baby. And if they just have the two talking to each other, there's a lot of opportunity for friction and tension, and then everything just dies because you never take the baby out into the field and let it grow. So what you want is a politically neutral group where there's a career ladder and they can get promoted. If you have that, you just have done a real kind of jujitsu move on the incentives inside an organization.
And China has done
Again,
that.
this is getting. Well, I'm talking a little bit about private sector. China has done a lot of
Okay.
things. They've actually read the playbook on a lot of things that the U.S. has done over the last 70 years and copied it.
Mm.
Um, even if you look at their FDA, they've almost copy
Yeah,
pasted.
it's true.
They've made a big change in their FDA, and a lot of it just reads like, "Wow, let's take the FDA website in the U.S. and copy paste it." But they've learned a lot. They learned the Vannevar Bush
Mm.
playbook from World War II, why it's incredibly important. Despite like a lot of libertarians think just have a free market and no government involvement in anything. Well, the fact that the U.S. succeeded over the last 70 years is because of we addressed a market failure problem. There are certain investments that are not good for any one company to invest in alone. No one company is going to create GPS satellites 50 years ago. No one company is going to invest in genetic engineering 50 years ago, and it was just didn't seem like it could yield anything. But the federal government invested. Now the Chinese government has understood that, and they're investing at an incredible rate in new technologies, artificial, from the AI ML stuff to hypersonics to many new technologies, and they got that playbook. They figured that out. Check. They've been able to create enough white space, enough freedom that you could develop some very successful technology companies, Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent, Huawei, and so on. So they figured out a lot of that balance stuff. So the next 20 years are not going to look like the last 50. The period of time in which the United States was sort of the sole power on earth is a historical blip. And we're going to have a new reality where we're not the sole superpower on earth, and we need to be prepared for that.
And by the way, that applies also to like cities, right? Like in a way, Columbus, Ohio used to be the Silicon Valley of the United States, and they were the Loonshot factory, and they lost it. And I wonder if a lot of the choices that San Francisco and the Bay Area in general are making is actually also not leading down the wrong path because they maybe don't even understand why they became a Loonshot factory to begin with.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, Cleveland was,
Cleveland, sorry, not Columbus. Cleveland.
yeah.
Yeah,
It's funny because Cleveland asked me to come and speak with them because they're really, if you look at the population and GDP of Cleveland actually versus Columbus, it's like really wow.
yeah, yeah.
It's been sadly a straight line down, but um, You're right. And so the question is, what do you do to transform? And so that you're exactly right. How do you nurture the appropriate loon shots, but also how do you build on your advantages, whatever they are? And they are often not obvious. As a kind of fun, when I know you asked me about how I got into writing, and so we're off on a long
Yeah,
tangent, but
but it's okay.
yeah,
And frankly, I think
the,
we should also talk about like phase transitions because I think the at some point because it's kind of one of the key insights of the book, right? Like that you're the fact that you came from a physics background allowed you to realize that these organizations are really most interesting when they're like this kind of balance, between the water being water and ice, or at that transition where you can actually be both, I guess, innovating and executing. And being in these transitions is probably the most interesting part of, frankly, countries and organizations. So I think this applies at a more meta level. And how do we, as the U.S., continue to have that? And can we, frankly?
yeah, no, that's a great point. It's and kind of we started this by talking about the challenges that companies face once they cross, once they're past the initial product market fit, and now they're in scaling, and now they have a portfolio they want to think about, is very different. So if you're the CEO or you're a manager or an executive team, you need to think not about how do we build this product, how do we complete these tasks, or even what products, but about how do we design our system. Because what you have is a large end system problem. What is the best way and to design this system to achieve the goals that we want? And generally speaking, the almost always the CEOs who call me up, it's, hey, I've got some awesome franchise. It might be insurance. It might be investment banking. It might be, some other retail services. It might be a technology product. And very often it's the CEO who was there in the beginning. And now it's like 5, 10 years, Spotify or Snapchat. And now they're 10 years in. That franchise hit. That's great. We're all over the world now. But I feel like the company has started to ossify. It's somehow turned a corner. And that's the phrase transition. That you're talking about.
Yeah.
That's when you go from being liquid,
Yeah.
you just something structurally changed and it flipped. All of a sudden, the water freezes
Yeah.
and it's just much more rigid. And the same people, just like the molecules in a glass of water, they're the exact same molecules, but when you change the temperature, their behavior completely changes. And so that's what
Yeah.
Loonshot is about. It's that how do you apply what is the science of phase transitions, um, which is just a tool or a technique that comes from seeing similar problems in the physical world when a large system suddenly changes its behaviors, even when there's no change in the fundamental parts. So why that change happens, which turns out to be not very complicated, it's sort of pretty easy to understand once you think about it. But it's a different way of thinking about companies and groups and organizations. But once you think about it in that way, it's not very hard to see. And then once you understand that you have that phase transition where you go from solid to liquid, it sounds like a metaphor, but you're an economist.
Mm-hmm.
At the heart of Loonshots is a new economic model for incentives inside companies and then applying these techniques to see what it tells you. Once you understand that, you realize that, oh, if you're an entrepreneur and you were there when it was 5 people, you were there when it's 20, you're there when it's 50. When it's 5, 20, or 50, everybody's stake and outcome is so high, nobody worries about your title or career. You deal with little companies all the time. Who cares about title or career? If your product works, everybody's going to be a hero and a millionaire. If it fails, you're all looking for a new job. So what happens is when every early stage product hits lots of bumps in the road, and so everybody unites to save that product and fix the flaws and smooth out the bumps until it succeeds. At a certain size and scale, your stake and outcome in that project starts to decrease. And at some point, it falls below the rewards from getting promoted. Once you're, a few hundred people, certainly a few thousand people, you could be, an assistant vice president, a VP, a senior VP, an EVP. And all of a sudden, the rewards from getting promoted are bigger than your equity stake. And now the conversation in the water around the water cooler shifts from how do we save this cool new idea that just hit some bumps in the road? What do we do? Let's roll up our sleeves to, I want to talk about my career path here. And that's the phase transition.
And so the
when you shift from
idea is to try to delay that phase transition as much as possible from maybe the Dunbar number of 150 or to thousands or maybe many more if possible.
right. The idea is how can you think differently about the underlying incentives and the underlying structure that causes that shift. So, for example, in water, you sprinkle, when it snows at night, you sprinkle salt on the sidewalk. Why? It changes the balance between the two forces that are underlying. One of those forces is binding energy that wants to lock every molecule rigidly in place, 2.7 angstroms, not 2.8 or 2.9 away from its neighbor. And the other is entropy that wants to let molecule, it's just a fancy word, means run around and be free. So normally those two forces flip at 32 Fahrenheit. But if you sprinkle salt in the water, you lower that point because you essentially weaken the binding energy. You make molecules more want to slosh around. So you wake up in the morning, you step on your sidewalk, and you wet your shoe in a puddle rather than slip in ice and end up in a hospital. So the equivalent for companies is, what are those structural things that you can do that are the equivalent of sprinkling salt in the water that help people focus more on the nurturing those crazy ideas without losing the focus on delivering on time, on budget. In other words, like you said at the beginning, how do I balance and achieve a liquid and a solid state at the same time? Life at 32 Fahrenheit.
I mean, what's interesting is, though, in the physical world, I mean, that's a law, right? Like, at physical transformation that happens, and you go below that, it's good. You're going to have a solid, and above that, you're going to have a liquid. And the companies, that's really more an emerging property of like whether or not you become ossified. People start caring about their careers, and maybe when in that and how that happens could be changed. But that's probably pretty different because that's not a law. It's more like how do different people react in different settings or systems.
Right. And so you can think of that as the job of the executive team. The CEO, the executive team, the board is, how do we maintain life at 32 Fahrenheit? How do we create the balance between the artists and the soldiers so neither side is growing at the expense of the other? And that can be a very difficult challenge. If you're a CEO and you see yourself as this wonderful pirate, and in fact, there are books written about let's be pirates and this is the only way to succeed. Well, that's actually a disaster. In fact, when Steve Jobs, as I wrote about, did that at his first stint at Apple, and people hold that up as saying it was a disaster, demotivated the entire company. And the Macintosh launched, it was a total flop as a product. People were leaving, including his buddy Wozniak, because that really is the wrong way to lead. You favor one of the groups over the other, whichever one it is. If you're in the military and you grew up a soldier and you favor only the soldiers with their metrics and on time and on budget and how many guns per month, and you try to apply that to the scientist, hey, it's Wednesday, and you Monday you had 4.7 ideas, and Tuesday you had 4.6 ideas. Today you're only at 3.5. Clock is ticking. Your scientists will be totally demotivated and leave. So as a manager and a leader, this gives you a somewhat different way to think about, and of course there's a lot more to it, and we're just talking at very high level, but it gives you a different way of thinking about your job is to maintain that life at 32 Fahrenheit, the balance between kind of the artists working on the crazy new ideas, which you want to fail, and the soldiers working on time, on budget, which you don't want to fail.
In fact, in the want to fail, I think the problem is most organizations can't accept failure as they become larger. And I don't know who gave the quote, right? I think something is the secret of great ideas, having 20 ideas and throwing out 19 bad ones. But it's actually, you have to fail your way to success. You just throw a lot of stuff on the wall until you find the right ones and you eliminate the bad ones.
Yeah, and ultimately, that's what holds organizations back. It's the fear and stigma of failure. You'll never get rid of the fear and stigma and failure. And I'll talk to people, groups that are considered incredibly wildly innovative. Whether it's the Lab 126, a secret lab at Amazon, or Google X, they still have that problem. You will never set it to zero. But what you want to try to do is find the techniques and strategies and structure that minimize that, especially making it clear to the organization. Soldiers, you want to be very clear. No, you can't be showing up on a customer's door, knocking on their door and saying, here's your toaster. Toaster, I ordered a television. Okay. You're not going to have a business for long. Your revenue isn't going to come in to pay for all the artists. And the artists, you actually want them to fail, as you say, because if you are, and again, this really gets back to this, a lot of CEOs and managers have this mindset that I just need to be the cheerleader, everybody innovate, innovate, innovate. When you send that message, the CEO is the chief innovation officer,
Yeah.
you actually create confusion because you don't, innovation is about trying lots of stuff that fails. If you're not trying lots of stuff that fails, you're not taking enough risk. It's a level of risk. You want one group to lower risk and one group to increase risk, intelligent risk taking. If you say the same thing to everybody, take risk, lower risk, take risk, lower risk, you'll just get confusion. You won't get solid and liquid, you'll just get slush.
No, and in
So what
fact, I
you
think you give two great examples of when people are just taking risks. I mean, the Pan Am example and the Polaroid example. At the end of the day, even though in a way they both saw the changes happening. I mean, I think the Polaroid case, he was at the early forefront of digital photography, but it's like, yeah, you can't make money selling the prints, and so we're not going to go into it. I mean, that to me that was shocking how aware they were of the changes happening and yet not changing, because they saw themselves as these innovation machines in that going down one specific path.
Yeah, in the case of Polaroid, which is very common in tech companies, they equated their mental model, their assumption was they equated innovation with product,
Yeah.
technology. As did Steve Jobs in his early days.
Yeah.
Bigger, faster, better computers. Bought Pixar because it was a bigger, faster, better computer. Started the next
Yeah.
computer company because it was a bigger, faster computer to compete on product with Apple. Edwin Land at Polaroid,
Yeah.
he was a genius Nobel level inventor of phenomenal products. He created a new molecule, to do instant photography.
Yeah.
He actually discovered how the brain works and processes color, which is an incredible theoretical process at the heart of understanding color vision. Instant photography itself was just an incredible product invention, the kind of radar that you use to get distances and focus. But he wasn't as interested in strategy innovations. And of course, what digital photography required was a strategic shift, not a product shift. The product shift he understood and advocated for,
Yeah.
but he didn't try to, he experimented. He loved experiments, and he experimented every day with new products. Actually, one of my favorite things about Land, which I still keep in mind, is he says, it's not a good day if I haven't done one experiment. Every day, he, even as a CEO, had to do an experiment. I actually take that in mind when I think of more broadly of experiments. There's how you manage your life, how you organize your time, how you structure your day, in addition to what you're trying and what you're writing or in your research or your company. But his vision was about product innovation is the thing that's really cool, and strategy innovation is not very interesting.
Yes.
And didn't spend a lot of
I
time
mean,
on
same
it.
with Pan Am, right? Like, it was always product, like a bigger plane, a bigger engine, a longer distance. And when the low cost model, which is the strategy change, arrived, they weren't ready for it.
That's right. And it was a guy who was not a pilot at all, not an engineer like Juan Trippe was at
Yeah.
Pan Am, was
Yeah.
an engineer and a pilot, and he just loved bigger, faster engines. And he was incredibly successful, started the jet
Yeah.
age. He single-handedly got the entire airline industry into jet engines and developed commercial jet aircraft. But it was this other guy at American Airlines who came up with the idea, which is no new technology. This reservation phone system that each of our agents uses internally? Here's a wacky idea. Suppose I just give that away to free, the stuff we use, the computer we have on our boxes inside our shop, to every travel agent in the United States. No new technology, just a wacky idea. And what happened? They all started using American Airlines and booking on American Airlines because they were using, by coincidence, the American Airlines reservation system, which is the origin of Sabre, which eventually was spun out. But all of those were strategy innovations. Was that, like I said, that was not at all glamorous. You didn't see that on the cover of Time magazine, but you did see Juan Trippe and Pan Am with their sexy jet engines on the cover of Time magazine.
And did you actually, as part of Loonshots, when you were doing the research, look at the current wars and what happened between Edison and Westinghouse and Tesla, et cetera? Like, could that have been part of the anecdotes, or because I actually don't know if Edison, because he created kind of this innovation factory, but I don't know, and it seemed to have some franchises ultimately. So I wonder how that played out and what happened there, but I don't know if you've actually looked into that.
You sort of have to pick your
Yeah,
battles, and so I wrote about the stories that I thought were most interesting and most surprising, with the kind of most relevant lessons for the story I was telling. I think Edison and Tesla is interesting, but I didn't spend a lot of time on it. It did, of course, create the first corporate R&D lab, which became General Electric
yeah,
R&D lab. Um, but he also he was a pretty strong business guy. I mean, he created the film industry, early
yeah.
film production and studios, except for the Jewish immigrants that had to flee because he was. I don't know if you could call this a good strategy or bad strategy. Probably not a very ethical strategy. If he kept hiring people to beat them up in New York
Yep.
and burn down their competing production shops, literally go and burn them down and beat them up. Those were Edison's people, kind of the immigrants who didn't have any money, kind of fled New York and said, "Where can we go that's near a border? And whenever Edison sends his damn police to beat us up, we can just jump across the border." I know. How about Southern California? A lot of empty space there, a lot of sunlight there. Great. And that was the birth of Hollywood, of course.
So moving on, maybe from Loonshots, I think recently you had, I think what I think you said it defined you as like a maybe the definite or like the innovation or insight of your career, and I think I think you've observed that the short term distribution of returns, I think, is 1/r cubed in financial markets rather than Gaussian distribution. And I think you then actually went out and did the math and figured out why. And so, first of all, I'm intrigued. Like, how does one go from writing a book on Loonshots and how do companies and countries keep innovating to then saying, there's this interesting problem in financial markets, where everyone says they're perfectly efficient, and yet obviously just by observation you realize that they have bubbles and they crash all the time. And so the Burton Bahcall random walked on Wall Street might maybe true in the long run. It does look more Gaussian then. Definitely not true in the short run. And they decide, okay, this is the problem I'm gonna fix, and I'm gonna think through. Like how does that happen? I mean, if you're comfortable
Well,
talking about it, or if that, I
yeah,
mean,
no,
maybe
that's
the
kind of, I think,
next.
um,
I trust the IQ of the audience,
no, it's, I guess it comes back to what you said we were discussing in the beginning, which is sort of choices and paths and career. And for me, I've always found that I couple to learning rate. There's a physics term of coupling constant. You either couple to something strongly or you don't. So for me, when I'm working on something and I'm really curious and I'm learning a lot, I get really excited and have a lot of energy. And I find that when get less curious, um, and I'm learning less, I just have less energy and I'm less motivated. And that
yeah.
even as a CEO, the first time I started, it was all sorts of really exciting new stuff to learn about how to be a better manager and leader in the first couple of years. And then you're transitioning, your early stage product, and now you're advancing it, and also that's really new. And then you're transitioning to pre-public, and there's a whole new world of that. Then you're transitioning to just post-public. But actually, after a while, for quite a while, there's not a lot of mystery to it. There's a lot of pretty straightforward stuff every 90 days, and actually, it's a lot easier, I think, than running a private company, for a lot of different reasons. This is a different discussion. Um, but a lot of things are about curiosity and challenge. So, for example, how I got into Loonshots, which is also how I got into this next project, and how I got into, I have kind of two parallel projects, one on why markets crash, which you mentioned briefly, and the other is on strategy, which also came from curiosity of really asking. I got invited to, one of the nice things of the last couple of years, a lot of pretty well-known companies and leaders invited me in to talk with them. And um, one of the areas I found most fascinating was the area that's probably the biggest business wealth creation opportunity of the 21st century, and that's cloud services. And I got pretty interested in the question just because I'd spent some time inside some of the major players, and it's, when they bring all these, the CTO, their annual retreat where they bring the top 200 largest companies in the world and their chief technology officers, and they bring in some guest speakers or whatever. And, you spend a lot of time with them. I go around asking this one question, which is 15, 20 years ago, if you'd asked anybody who knew anything about technology, who has the best cloud engineers in the planet, pretty much everybody would have said, well, Google, of course. Yet fast forward, and this kind of $1 trillion race to own an incredible opportunity, which only a few companies will win, which is, hey, every company in the world, give us your IT. Get rid of all that hardware stuff and we'll take care of everything else. That's a lot of money. That's a big
That's a
opportunity.
huge idea. Yeah.
Yeah. And the company that won that race, and this is kind of the first chapter, the early history of the race, which I find fascinating. That what happens in the next 10 years we'll see. But the first chapter of that race, the first 10 years of that race, it wasn't Google that won. It was a company that sells diapers online. It was Amazon that just completely cleaned up. And Google was kind of nowhere. And Microsoft caught up, started behind, but eventually caught up. Why? What did Amazon do right and Google do wrong? And so I found that a curiosity, just a fascinating question to go through the early history of that and understand actually from the customer side and from each of the three major players there, what happened. And so that's kind of one project. But each of those is driven by kind of curiosity and challenge. Can you explain that? Can you find some underlying principles that help you understand not only that, but here's another weird thing. About 10 years ago, shopping malls started to really decline. In fact, most shopping mall companies were headed for bankruptcy, yet one didn't. What was it that they did that the others didn't do? Turns out it's very similar in a certain way, same principles to what Amazon did and Google didn't. And then I spent some time in the music industry. I know we're going a little bit of a digression, but
No, but it's totally
kind
fine.
of how, I think you asked, how did I get to places? It's by this sort of thing, following curiosity. I got invited.
But how does the curiosity start though? Like, is it just an observation or an insight? Do you allocate time in your day to like thinking through big thoughts, or is it just you latch on to something that you thought is interesting, and then you dig further, and as you dig further, it becomes more compelling, and it takes a life of its own.
Yeah, it's a random walk. It's a lot like being an entrepreneur. You think you know what your product is. People who tell you, as you and I know, anyone who's either been on the investing side or a real entrepreneur, not writing about it from a theoretical perspective in a business journal, but anyone in real life knows, you start with an idea and you completely random walk. You just,
Yeah.
it's like I think I wrote about it in the last chapter, the appendix there, about this, why the whole disruptive innovation thing is silly. That so many of the greatest business ideas you were random walking your way.
Yep.
There's some principles to the random walk that can help you. So the answer to these ideas, it's the way I think about kind of writing and the problems is you hear something. Like when I was spending some time with folks in the music industry who invited me in to speak with them, somebody said, nobody knows this, but the music industry is the most profitable it's ever been in its entire history. And actually, they conceal this for good reason. They conceal it because they kind of don't, they like the fact that people think the music industry is dying because of piracy and stuff. But what really happened, the music industry was dying around when Napster hit, and, it just sales of CDs were just falling off a cliff. And the music industry was just headed for the graveyard, the major studio labels. And in fact, companies like Spotify kept knocking on their door and saying, we have a kind of a different model. We'll pay you, a penny, fraction of a penny every time, for one of your songs. Their initial reaction was like, get out of my office. I make $13.78 on a CD. What the hell are you talking to me about a fraction of a penny? Go away. They kept knocking on their door as the studio labels are heading for bankruptcy and saying, we actually pay you every time the song gets played, not just once. Oh, by the way, customers can't really return the thing with a broken plastic cover that you have to replace. So eventually, when streaming came over, not only did revenues bounce back because people are spending more, but profit margins went through the roof. And that number is not obvious because they don't have to make plastic and they get paid every single time. So now their profits are much bigger, but the algorithms for calculating are much more complicated. With CDs, you just count. And the artist says, I want X%. And you're like, well, you can debate what X is, but it is what it is. With the algorithms, everybody shrugs their shoulder and they have to trust, guess who? The company. So anyway, you ask how you get curious. I was like, when someone was telling me that, an insight, I was like, that's interesting. And the way I imagine is kind of like writing or these business problems is you're running around a forest. That there's a clearing inside, but it's kind of a mess and you don't know a way in. You just keep looking. You're running around the edge of the forest until you see a little red sparrow. And that sparrow, you follow that sparrow, you follow that thread. And so I followed that thread and that connected, what did Amazon do that Google didn't do? What did this one shopping mall do that others didn't? How did the music industry escape death? And how they're all connected by these kind of three
But
principles.
how did that original conversation even happen? It just happenstance, or were you looking for conversations like that, or is it like you take time to have meetings with like people that you deem interesting just to see what they have to say, or?
Well, I guess that's a little bit of an advantage of having written a book, is these companies who are far outside my field, music industry or cloud services or media companies, invite me in to talk with their executive teams. And, part of that is I talk through some ideas and kind of new ideas and some perspective. But part of that, I'm also just curious. What is it that helped these guys succeed? What do they think? Where did they go wrong? And, when you're curious and you're genuinely interested and you don't judge and you're asking a little bit about history rather than tell me about your 5-year plan, you're asking a little bit about history. People like to talk about history and you learn all sorts of stuff. So anyway, it was really just curiosity. Loonshots was curiosity. And challenge. So for 10 or 12 years, whatever, when I was running a company, especially a public company, I had blinders on like any CEO, and you're just putting out fires and there's earnings and there's board members and there's this issue and that issue. And, sadly to say, if I would change something in hindsight, I would probably change this. I didn't have much time for reading because I was, dealing with fires all the time and focusing on what we need to do to succeed. So I'd be reading trade stuff and trade journals and product stuff, but not really reading more broadly. And then a friend challenged me to give a talk on something that I was totally not related to my work. And that was the one ground rule. So I'd been in theoretical physics before, and I said, what would be fun? I've noticed sometimes chatting with people, it's sort of fun to try to tease out larger patterns in history. So can I tease out how did the human species evolve from, like many animals, just seeing stuff around them happen, or the early days of the human species of seeing lightning and fires and floods and famines and just assuming that it's God's at work, to where we are today. What are the understanding the laws of nature? If you had to, in 45 minutes, summarize 3,000 years of history, how would you tease out what are the 7 or 8 biggest important milestones in understanding the laws of nature around us. And how can you explain that to an audience in 45 minutes? I thought that would be kind of a fun challenge. And I really enjoyed it. It was I ended up taking off a week or two from work. And in a weird random walkway, that led to
That's
Loonshots.
really cool. And when was that? And when did Loonshots come out? Just so I get a sense of like the timing and the process.
Oh, I think I was asked to do this kind of fun, weird talk. Maybe I didn't immediately say, "Oh, okay, this is Loonshots." No, I ended up finding that I really enjoyed going back in history and looking at patterns and seeing if there were some patterns. And at the same time, there's so much communication that is not very good about this stuff.
Yeah,
People don't really care about reading facts or tables or lists. They like stories and they like to be
absolutely.
entertained and they like it. So there was a challenge in how do you tell it in a, here's a big idea. Having been in theoretical physics, I kind of got the
Yeah.
science of it. But how do you tell it in a way that resonates with your average person who likes to, eat pizza and have a beer, which I do too,
Yeah.
right? But how do you, and doesn't happen to have any training uh, in theoretical physics. And I'm of the opinion that anybody can understand anything. If you can't explain it to somebody so that a 12-year-old can understand it, then you don't really understand it very well. So how
So
do I
so you
explain?
discovered your inner storyteller.
Uh, well, I think as a biotech CEO, you get a lot of experience in that because unlike
That's
your
true, actually.
business in tech, where you have numbers that you can track and traction numbers that you can follow. In biotech, you're explaining the vision when you're in early stage and
Mm,
you're focused on research and development, why targeting this protein in a cell could help cure this disease. And that's a story. Today, the audience of investors and portfolio managers is much more sophisticated than 20 years ago. I mean, everybody has a PhD or MD. But 20 years ago, there was a lot of generalists, and you had to explain that in plain language that made sense. So you sort of learn that. How do you take a technical scientific concept and explain it in language that resonates and excites people? And so I did that first with science. And then uh, I got really curious, sort of, again, coming back to where weird ideas come from. It's really like finding that red sparrow or finding the wait, what?
hmm
I got really curious about this weird fact that if you look at kind of the most important idea in the history of our species. And you're right. If you think about the history of our species as kind of a calendar year,
hmm
where we are and all the stuff we take for granted has really happened on December 31st in the last few hours of that calendar year. But for most of that calendar year, the human species believed that there were gods and, causing lightning and fires. So the most important idea in the history of the human species. By the way, every now and then I ask this at a talk, and I remember one talk recently. I said, "What's the most important idea in the history of the human species?" Some guy like raises his hand in the back and goes, "Weed." And I was explaining, actually, thank you, sir, but weed is a product, not an idea. uh, but it's the idea that around us are laws of nature, and we can understand them through experiments. Because that idea changed the dynamic from we need rulers and authorities and religious leaders to tell us the truth to a democratization of truth. Truth is accessible to everybody. And that transition opened up the way for essentially science and the laws of nature, which opened up the way to industrialization, which led to all the stuff we have in the last couple hundred years, freeing humans from muscle power to essentially infinite power.
It's actually interesting because in a way it happened a long time ago. People started realizing they could replicate and do things, and yet it took kind of Francis Bacon to kind of formalize the scientific method and kind of accelerate perhaps this process for us in the world we live today.
Well, I think, a lot of people, writers, philosophers and historians, will pay attention to philosophers. I don't think philosophers had anything to do with it, or had in hindsight had in fact very
Oh
little.
no, it's the practitioners. I think most discoveries were
Yes,
done through people trial and error. In fact, the best doctors were like the animal surgeons, right, rather than the people that often priests that were supposed to be curing you. So no,
right.
most of these things was discovered through doing.
Right. And as an example, you take a look at Copernicus when he came up with, when he published in 1543, um, his uh, book on planetary motion, which wasn't the first time that idea was suggested. It didn't make much of a splash. Nobody particularly cared because it was a theory. And in fact, the church wasn't at all offended. The church encouraged him to publish because they're like, it's a different way of viewing the world. And, if it gives us a better calendar, we're all for it. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a bunch of words because it didn't predict anything useful. Copernicus's theory was no more, he designed it to be exactly the same as the old Greek theory by construction. So we
Yeah.
had no more predictive value than the old theory. It was just a different way mathematically of looking at the same thing, and nobody really cared. And nobody paid much attention. Mostly they ridiculed it until Kepler, 60, 70 years later,
Yep.
came and firstly fixed a few things and then showed that actually it could predict something better. It was useful. And it wasn't a giant revolution. It was sort of 20 or 30 years after Kepler did that navigators started using it and saying, actually, that German guy, Kepler, his stuff, his tables, it kind of work better than the old thing that people have been using for a few thousand years. So maybe we'll use that. And that's when the shift happened, and that's really cemented. So I think it's less about the philosophy and more about the practice and
The
practitioners
practice.
and
Yeah.
finding something
Absolutely.
actually useful. And so anyway, it was curiosity, the curiosity that drove Loonshots. I enjoyed giving that talk, and so I just found that I enjoyed
Yeah.
the challenge of trying to see patterns in history and explain them in a useful way to folks that would also be kind of entertaining. And then I got invited to, but I kept getting stuck on this one puzzle, which is for roughly 1,000 years, England and Western Europe was a backwater of the world that nobody cared about. All the important advancements in whether it was early science or irrigation or mining or technology and paper and printing and
Yeah.
mathematics
It
and
was all China.
astronomy and medicine. China,
Well, China, the Arabic
Islamic
world.
Empire, and India.
Exactly. Yeah.
Between the three of them, that was well over 50% of the GDP of the world, and England was, a percent or a fraction of a percent, and Western Europe was a very small player. Almost all the trade was dominated between China and India and the Islamic Empire, and Western Europe was kind of this backwater. Yet, those ideas really exploded in Western Europe, not in China. And as I kind of wrote about, many of the early stage ideas appeared in China 600 years earlier in the Northern Song dynasty. Ideas about astronomy, ideas about science, scientific method approaches. Yet they didn't take off, but they did take off in Western Europe. And I just got curious about that and filed that away kind of in my head. This is a little bit of a long
Yeah.
answer just because we're friends and we can talk about it. And uh, then a few years later, I got asked by President Obama's Council of Science Advisors to work with them on the Future of National Research project. How should we structure national research? And as part of that, started to learn more and more about the World War II story, which is when national research really had a big inflection point, driven by Vannevar Bush and what he did in World War II, driven by the fact that, as not many people understood, what he did and the kind of organizational structure stuff that he did, which led to the inventions that his group came up with, turned the course of World War II. And I started putting some things together, and I said, this is really interesting. You see this same pattern. You see in world history, you had these tiny little nation states which nucleated this early stage idea, this loonshot, the most important loonshot in human history, that they're laws of nature, whereas the giant empires quashed it, China, Islam, and India. In my industry at the time, you had Pfizer Novartis, Merck, the giant empires, and all of the loonshots were being nucleated by the tiny little biotech companies, more or less. So markets had segmented in that way. And what it was clear from what Vannevar Bush did is that you can do the same sort of thing inside a company. You want to create this balance where you have on the empires and you have the loonshot factories, but you need the ties between the two. And that was the key, the dynamic equilibrium, the ties between the two, which capital markets naturally create between pharma and biotech. World history created through trade between China and the nations of Western Europe. But companies have not thought about that, replicating that model as intentionally as Bush did. And so that's where kind of Loonshots came from, is the combination of those ideas. I started writing it because I was just fascinated by the world history and the science questions. And then the publishers and the editors came back like, that World War II story, super cool. Pan Am story, great. Your 17th century astronomy stuff, could you move that back maybe? Could you maybe not open with 17th century astronomy and Chinese history and that sort of stuff? I'm like, but this is really fascinating. And they're like, yeah, we know you find that fascinating. Could you maybe move that to the back or something? Eventually it got taken out and I found a way to restore it at the end. But that's how Loonshot started. It was a random walk.
It's actually interesting when you think about it, because you have these same principles that apply at the city level, at the country level, at the company level, right? And it's always like empire loonshots. It's just at a different structure. And the fact that you can draw these parallels is actually really interesting.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, they're all connected by this,
of course,
not very complicated observation that when you have a system, you have two phases. You're either liquid or solid. And if you want to do both, you need to find a way. And so that idea is present whenever you have a large system. And that large system may be nations and nation states. It may be markets where you have a bunch of companies, or it may be inside a company. But they're all essentially what are called emergent properties of systems. And that's why I just find that kind of interesting. There are a lot of people who work with small companies and coach entrepreneurs and what to do better. And I don't spend a lot of time on 10-person companies and so on. But the larger observations, working with the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, or intelligence community organizations, that's a higher purpose.
Absolutely.
And like I said, working with larger companies that have scaled and have gone through that transition and are trying to wrap their minds around. I find that an interesting puzzle and problem, and kind of that's why I do it. And when I, have good chemistry with the people and like the goals, I get engaged. That was a very long answer to your question of how did you end up in this market stuff. The point was I just keep following curiosity.
A few questions.
And the curiosity.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one question, and to kind of maybe tie down or close down the Loonshots category, then I'm actually intrigued as to why books versus, like the Wait by Why author who's decided, like, I'm doing a series of blogs, right? There's a bunch of ways you can actually express your curiosity. But I think some of the conclusions that some things I'm seeing is like, from the outside, it looks to me like Xi Jinping is going in China into the emperor model, right? It seems to be like he's going back to the empire model that may very well, in the long run, not today. Like, to me, Deng Xiaoping kind of created this phase transition where you could let's create these free trade zones and special administrative zones. Let's have innovation, and let's keep having the core of the country with these belief systems, and kind of found that balance that ultimately I think led to the free market reforms that led to things like Alibaba and Baidu still rather constrained, and Tencent. I'm not sure if that's going to continue. I mean, from the outside, it feels like they're going to the heavy emperor centralization model. But I don't know if you've put any thought into that.
Well, I would separate two things. One is being authoritarian and about political and civil freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, which China has made its choice. The other is being authoritarian about technology and new ideas. Those aren't the same.
Okay.
So what China is experimenting with is, let's be authoritarian about one, but not the other. Can we create a white technologies and new ideas, and they're doing it very well in their military apparently, but also in their certain industries, certain sectors, including the technology industry, while still being authoritarian and autocratic about civil freedoms. The U.S. is more democratic in that sense about both, but they're trying.
Sorry about that. We had
No problem.
I had a small internet issue here. Let's see. Yeah, it's back. We're back online. Um, so the, I mean, I'll edit it on YouTube, so it won't have this issue where it disconnected for a minute or two. I mean, you seem to be advocating for public investment in technology. But when I take a look back and I look at what countries have tried to do, I mean, like France tried to fund, Boule in order to compete with IBM, and we had like Europe that tried to build a Google competitor. I mean, my observation is like it's usually like the well-connected that end up getting the projects funded. It never ends up being like the things that are really the most valuable for society. And people that are creating like these whatever public government venture capital systems end up doing really badly.
Yeah, pretty much every city, and I don't know how many cities have approached me and said, "How do we become a biotech hub?" Well, really, here's the thing about markets. Once you have a market, you don't really need more than two or three, because markets, if you want to succeed in an industry, whether it's biotech or tech,
Yeah.
you want a market. You need investors with capital there. You need employees who are trained and experienced, and you need vendors who are used to serving that industry. Just to give an example, vendors are not really in biotech who build chemistry hoods, or refrigerators to super cool. They're not going to go to Topeka, Kansas. How many?
Yeah.
So they're going to go where the most biotechs are concentrated. Same with employees. You graduate from Kansas State University. You want to work in biotech. You don't stay in Kansas. You go to Cambridge, Massachusetts, or San Francisco, or some of the other. So there are only a couple. So there's a market phenomena. Europe, far
Sure.
better than I do, but it's very tough to solve that critical mass problem. And typically, if you're a city, you want to pick a niche where you have a certain competitive advantage and build off that niche. The cities, the strategic example I find very interesting is Austin, Texas.
Hmm.
So 30 or 40 years ago, Austin, Texas was not really a very big city. It was pretty rural, and you had like cows. But what they did have, music festivals. So they said, well, we're pretty good at music festivals. Suppose we build off the music festival idea, because we're sort of suited for that, and we're getting people, and we're kind of known for that, to try to bring in people who make technology for music. Okay, well, that's not a big ad, and all of a sudden you have a technology for music festival. Well, we're doing technology for music. Some of that is similar to technology for film. So let's bring in technology for film and maybe some film people. So they built from a tiny little town to becoming like an incredible entrepreneur capital, not by flipping a switch and saying theoretically, oh, how do we become an entrepreneur capital? They built from a unique.
But maybe at a national level, right? Like some of the examples you gave were like GPS and things like that. So how do you make sure that the government investment or public investment in R&D ends up going into actual innovation that really is a public service, as opposed to whatever pet projects or going down the wrong rabbit holes? Because it's easy to say, oh, the government should invest in public projects, but like defining what those are is really hard.
Yeah, so those are the conditions. How do you achieve life at 32 Fahrenheit, where it will fail when you have a politically minded person in charge of the projects, when there are political agendas at stake, when what succeeds or fails is based on other considerations beyond just creating a portfolio of Loonshots. But you want a strategy and you want a portfolio approach. You can't just say, let's innovate on everything and throw spaghetti in the
Yeah.
wall. You have to say strategically, step back. And the same thing with companies. Companies that just say, let's just throw a ton of innovation spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. That doesn't work. You need to work backwards from the, certain views on options of what the future might look like. Let's work backwards from there, forwards from what we think, where we may be starting with some advantages. What are some seeds we can plant that will look good, create some nice probabilistic opportunities across these different future scenarios? We can't be 100% sure it's here or here or here, but if here are three main scenarios, how do we place some bets so we'll be okay, whichever one of these succeed? And what are the right processes to put in place that we can kind of continue to plant these seeds and then give them water and nurture them in the appropriate way while we're still uncertain about the future? So there is no one magic wand, simple answer. You really have to think thoughtfully about, let's pick a particular strategic portfolio of where we want to focus our innovation that ties into something we're good at. And then what's the right process?
Sure.
So that's why entrepreneurs and VCs are like, that's boring. How about I just find some cool new project and fund that and, take it to IPO? But it's a system problem. And some people find that interesting. I'm one of the nerds that finds that kind of system problem interesting.
So circling back, so why did you decide that, okay, to the expression of your curiosity and your research, and it sounds like there's, the one you already did, Loonshots, but there's two more going down the pipe on like general strategy that succeed versus fail in certain markets on the one hand, and like why markets crash was just another very big idea. I think they're all expressing themselves in the form of books, if I'm not mistaken. And if so, why books versus, whatever series of blog posts, whatever cartoons?
I think if it's a discipline, it forces you to think through things in a better way, think through the communication in a better way. A blog, you can put up whatever you want and you have no feedback. And so it's generally lower quality. Anyone who's written knows that, for me, I wrote, roughly speaking, 10x and chopped off 90% of it. And that became Loonshots. So I researched many other industries, wrote complete chapters with incredible stories, like how the worst drug, I sometimes tell this story in talks, how the worst drug in history became a life-saving medicine. And it's a moving, amazing story with some really important lessons. It just didn't fit in the narrative of the book. So I sadly had to cut that whole chapter. And one of the things you learn from writing is that people don't really care about ideas. They care about people. Now, if you want to perhaps communicate some ideas, the best way to do that is tell the story of those ideas as revealed through the story of people. You mentioned Edwin Land and Juan Trippe and
Bill Bryson does that really well. A short story of nearly everything, which is not nearly that short, is really the story of the scientists behind the science more than the science itself. And I thought that was fascinating. And I think that approach is really compelling.
Yeah. My favorite account, I read, obviously extremely widely on the 17th and 18th century science. And kind of my favorite account is Arthur Koestler's The Sleepwalkers, which
absolutely
he was you know it. I'm glad you know it because it's a little bit of an older book, but he is a brilliant kind of Nobel level novelist and writer coming from a psychology background who had some scientific training. So his characters are incredibly three-dimensional and he's opinionated about them. And he is not shy at all and he gets emotionally invested in his characters and he tells you that. And it's just a much more fun read than very dry versions of that stuff. And so that works. That's exciting. And so that was a challenge for me. So for me, I ended up doing it because, you like heli skiing, right? Where you get in a helicopter or something. And what's the thing where you go in a kite over oceans?
Kite surfing.
Kite surfing. Okay.
Yeah.
Those are big challenges, right? So suppose I gave you a challenge. Here's your idea. You need to create a new economic model for the behavior of people inside organizations. Also, you need to solve that in a way that economists never solve models, which is to use the science of tools and techniques borrowed from physics. By the way, you then need to do something that neither economists nor physicists do, which is you need to translate that into practical business lessons. Oh, also you need to do history. You need to learn, aviation industry history, World War II history, modern European history, world civilization history. You need to do that, and you need to combine them in a way that tells a good story that your average person can read it on one level. Your scientist can read it on another level. Your business guy can read it on a third level. They're all levels of a cake, but they're all eating the same cake. That's a challenge. Like maybe the same reason you asked me why it's the same reason you do heliskiing or the kite ocean thing, kite
Kite
surfing.
surfing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a crazy challenge. Yeah, you need to combine all these things and figure out the right way to tell the story, and so that it's a coherent, digestible cake that goes down well. So in a blog post, you're just communicating some facts, but you're not solving the bigger problem of how do I tell a story? Why is the Pan Am story connected to the World War II story, is connected to Edwin Land's story, is connected to Steve Jobs' story, is connected to, what happened in China
Yeah.
600 years ago, how they're all tied together by one thread. So the reason I did that is because it's a fun, exciting challenge, but it also communicates the ideas in
Eh,
a way that more people can relate to, enjoy, and absorb. And so the reaction over it was totally unexpected because I also like just, the puzzle solving of telling a good story and also things that make me laugh. So a lot of the times I'm like, oh my God, this is fucking hilarious. And I'm like writing something. I'm like, oh man, I'm like laughing so hard. And to be fair, like half the time I'll show it to my wife or somebody and they're like, what are you talking about? Like what? And I'm like, oh, I guess that was only funny to me. But some other times it's like, this is kind of amazing. And, this is kind of funny. And you kind of want to share that with people because it's cool. It makes people, get excited and feel good and see the world in a new way and laugh a little bit. And you can't really do that in a series of disconnected blog posts. You can't hold their attention in that way. But you also, I'm not sure you have as much
yeah.
impact, right? Because uh, once you, so you already mentioned a couple stories, and I find I go all these places. Nonprofit organizations call me up. One of them said, "Could you do our what do they call it? A board of trustees, annual dinner or something?" All these famous people, and then he calls me up. It's like, "Can you tell the Pan Am story? Can you tell the da 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 story? Can you tell the this story?" So people, it's like the Bible. People remember the stories, the hero's journey stories. Whereas if in a simple blog post, um, they usually don't. So
Absolutely.
uh, I I random walked into Loonshots with a combination of this President Obama's council stuff and some history of
So
science
how long did
stuff.
that take? I mean,
Um,
like from the day you decided, okay, I'm writing a book.
oh, oh yeah, you did ask me that. Sorry, we go on a lot of digressions here, but
Non
um,
sequiturs are awesome. It's okay.
uh, so I left my company and I thought I would immediately go to do another CEO gig. Like if you've been a CEO for 13 or 14 years or whatever, you're like, well, what does everybody do? Well, they go and they do another, company. Um, and this come back to something you and I were talking about offline, which is in your thinking about how you want to develop and grow and what you want to be when you grow up or what you want to do with the rest of your life, learning to separate what people expect from you from versus what you really want for yourself, what you really enjoy, is something that took me quite a long time to figure it out. I was, for example, I was very good at um, physics, theoretical physics and mathematics. I, followed the usual path of young kids who were very good at that sort of stuff and accelerated very quickly. And there were a lot of people that were patting me on the back for doing that better, faster, more thoroughly. And so I just kept going for what people patted around me were patting me on the back for. And at some point in my late 20s, I was like, am I really enjoying this? And theoretical physics has hit sort of a lull in some ways. That's a longer story, but kind of I get excited by learning how the world works around us. And you're sort of in a very narrow slot in theoretical physics that hasn't really moved very much. And it's a small community, so you kind of know everybody and they know you, and you have plenty of scar tissue and experience. And so there were a lot of opportunities. But I said, what do I really want to do? I said, that weird exercise where I used to communicate this kind of fun talk of like 3,000 years in 45 minutes. That was really fun because I read. I really didn't read much and learn much outside the very narrow trade stuff that I was reading for 13 years or so. Maybe I'll just write up these ideas as an essay. And so that's how I started. I actually called it Movies, Drugs, and Baseball, which is essentially why the movie industry is fragmented into these empires
Yep.
and small production shops. The drug discovery industry is fragmented into the Merck, Pfizer, Novartis empires and the biotechs. And in world history, you had the China, Islam, India, and the tiny little loonshot nations in Western Europe. And I thought that's really kind of fun stuff. And let me just write that up as an essay. And it's kind of like baseball, where you have the Yankees and the Red Sox manage the franchise players, and then all the early stage guys compete in the AAA, AA leagues, and so on. So that's why still the folder on my computer is called MDB, Movies, Drugs, and Baseball. And then you asked what happened. Well, I random walked. I wrote that up as an essay, and I thought, wow, this is really fun. I'm kind of enjoying, actually, oddly, the craft of it, which was a completely different skill set, which is learning rhythm and ear for language and how you do that craft and how you organize your day. It's like we were saying offline, like it's like you're an entrepreneur, right?
Yeah.
Totally new job and new skill set, and how you structure and how you work and how you develop an ear for what works and what doesn't, how you get feedback, your process. Anyways, I sent that off to some author friends, and one of them is a well-known writer who's written both essays and books that have done well. And he said to me, people don't really do 15,000 word essays anymore in journals. This is really a book. There's actually a lot of important ideas in here, and you may want to consider putting them into a book, which I'd never really considered before. And then I was at friend's place for a wedding. Do you know Olivia Fox, a mutual friend? I think you.
It rings a bell. Probably
Anyway,
not that well, but yeah.
Anyway, I was at her wedding, and she'd written a book that had done reasonably well, and we were good friends for years. And she had her lit agent came out for her wedding, and she said, "Oh, Safi, this you should really send your essays. Really sounds like fascinating ideas to this guy over here." And I talked to him, and he said, "Yes, send me your essay," which I did that night. He said, "I'm going to be in a plane flying back to New York, and I'll read it." So I sent it to him that night, and Monday morning I get a call. He said, "I want to sign you up."
Wow.
Like, sorry, and who are you again? And he said, "Well, I represent like this is just like Satya Nadella and Eric Schmidt and like all these Tom Brady, the football player."
Yeah.
I'm like, "What? I don't even know what a lit agent does exactly, huh?" And he's like, and I. You do sort of, you're in the business world. You're like, before you sign an agreement, you kind of do a little diligent. Like, and I said, is there somebody I could talk to who's worked with you? Maybe, I don't know. And he's like, absolutely. You get off the phone. Literally like 7 minutes later, the president of Random House Publishing calls me. "I hear you want to work with Jim Levine." I'm like, what? Who the hell is this guy? And like 7 minutes after that, who was it? Don Ariely calls me. You remember the Predictably Irrational?
I love Dan Ariely.
I love Don Ariely. And I had met him. I had met Don at various like gatherings and stuff.
Yeah.
And 7 minutes after I'm like, well, who the hell is this guy? It was just very funny. It was totally naive and didn't know anything about it. But I signed with him, and one thing led to another, and boom, Loonshots came out.
How many years later?
It wasn't that long. I mean, I had kind of drafted the essay and had done a fair amount of the research for it, but most of it was research, like maybe a year or two of research,
Yeah.
and then the writing itself was less than a year. But I imagine you like the heli skiing kite kiteboarding challenge. You say, listen, you want to combine economics and physics, storytelling, practical business lessons. And here's the thing. Here's a new challenge. Why don't you see if you can say something original about World War II? Because only about 1 million articles and people have been over that territory, right? So, like, that's like saying, why don't you do kiteboarding, but why don't you tie, 100-pound sack around your
Yeah.
waist? And I actually found I really enjoyed going into the Library of Congress and teasing out, going into specialist military historian journals. Once you understand the layers of sort of historical onion, the very superficial stuff you read in popular histories, I just liked.
Sure. And is the process the same now for like the upcoming books, or probably you're even better at it now, so maybe it goes faster because you actually.
No, you've learned you
Yeah.
learn a ton of stuff about how to read better, write better, do research better, get more organized, and really, good organization is a weapon. I mean, once you
Absolutely.
understand how to organize your reading and how to organize your development process, how to organize your writing, and how they're sort of different buckets, and how you want to be
So
very
is
mindful
there
about
such
which
a
bucket.
thing as a typical day for you now, or is it a typical week or month? Like, how do you structure yourself then?
Well, it depends about what phase you're in. Now I'm in a uh, research phase on one particular project, so I'm actually loving it so much. I'm like up till 1 or 2 a.m. I just can't get enough because I just enjoy it. So I wake up in the morning, can't wait to dive in. But there are little secrets to that. Like, one of the great ones is I forget who originally suggested, but probably a lot of good authors do it, is you always quit in the middle at night. You don't finish something completely where you don't know where you're going next, because then in the morning you wake up and you sort of procrastinate because you don't really know where you're
Mm,
going. But if you've got a great thread and you kind of know where that thread is going, whether pure research or writing, you leave a little post-it like, here's where I want to go. And then in the morning, like, you can't wait to start up that engine again. And uh, yeah, so in a research phase, a day looks like one thing, and writing phase, days look like something else, and then I balance that with a sort of uh, you know other business stuff I do. But most of the time, I'm right now in this research phase. And I think you asked uh, before we went on about 57 digressions. Um, I, I before I did, sorry. Um, you asked, like, how did you random walk into some new things that I'm working on? So I kind of random walked into Loonshots in sort of the way that I described, following, the little red sparrow and seeing where it led, and it sort of led to all these sort of surprising and fun, as well as ideas. And um, then what I'm doing now is I have these two separate projects. This is sort of an interesting challenge, but it's where organization helps. One is the strategy stuff,
mhm.
how Amazon beat Google, and how that's tied to all sorts of interesting, surprising things that are in the sports world as well, and the military world as well, and how you can create sort of a simple story around that. So I keep an Evernote notebook of, as I think of new ideas, which can happen randomly, or come across something that's relevant to that project, I file it away in the right category there. And then the other is this kind of a little more technical question or problem, which is a fair amount of mathematics to it. Building a new economic model, some new mathematical techniques to solve it on the kind of why markets crash. That came from, you sort of asked where that came from. While I was writing Loonshots, after I tell the business story, as I'm thinking of some fun ways to explain um, what is a phase transition. If you haven't worked in physics your whole life, how do you explain it? And so obviously the glass of water is a simple way to see that. That's a very familiar one. But people think, oh, that only happens in materials. What does that have to do with people? Well, it happens on highways. Cars go from smooth flow to jammed flow. That's a phase transition, because it's the same underlying principle of having emergent properties of the whole that don't depend on the details of the
Yep.
parts. Right? It doesn't matter if you have big cars or small cars, you will go in jammed flow. And there's certain principles that you can apply. I said, well, that was sort of fun. Forest fires is another one, a good example of, when wind speed exceeds a critical value, or dryness exceeds a critical value, small fires will erupt. That's a phase transition. So I said, I need one more. I was writing a short chapter on phase transitions. I need one more sort of short, fun example, maybe a couple sentences, and move on, of a system suddenly changing. And I said, well, markets, that's an obvious one. There's a no-brainer. You go from like one state and whoosh, it seems like all of a sudden it changes, just like the glass of water changes, or highways go from smooth flow to jam flow. That's kind of obviously a phase transition, and seems like it should be obvious, at least to me, like the underlying model, because they're sort of two competing forces. When you tease aside sort of the irrelevant factors, they're kind of two competing forces, just like in a glass of water, or just like in a highway, or just like in a company. Here are the two competing forces in markets. And as you change some stuff, you will get a sudden. And I said, well, I know that thousands of physicists have worked on, moved from personal experience, have gone from physics to working in quantitative finance. And so I know somebody's worked this out in detail. So let me just go into the literature, find a couple references, and, tell the short story in like a paragraph or two, and then move on with the rest of the book. Like 1 month later, I'm like, I don't see this anywhere in the literature. Like, people have had this sort of obvious ideas about how this connects to magnets, like, oh, spin up and spin down, you're a buyer, you're a seller. That's sort of an obvious analogy. And so a lot of people did that. And, but they didn't solve it. They didn't say like, oh, well, here's the phase transition. They didn't connect it to finance theory. Like, here's earnings and here's prices, which is what you need. You need a map between a magnet and earnings, otherwise, and prices. Otherwise, you have nothing. You're just words. So I was like, that's really weird. And I just kept reading, and I was like, so then I'm like, well, it's been a while, but let me pull out my very rusty physics pencil. And I kind of, this is the area that I had worked in. And so I was like, I know that model. It's not that hard to solve. So let's just write it down. And then after, a few hours, I'm like, oh, that's why. Because there's something missing here. Because, in magnets, you can have up or down, but when they demagnetize, the average magnetization is zero. You don't have zero prices in the real world. I'm like, yeah, that's a little bit of a problem. Actually, you don't have negative prices either. So something's right here. Intuitively, I knew, kind of time in capital markets, I knew that you're sort of capturing the essence of the thing, but something's missing. So that was very frustrating then I actually put the Loonshots book aside, because I was so curious, this got to be the answer. This got to be it. And then after 3 weeks of just kind of ridiculous, trying every possible idea to try to make it work. One night I had a kind of a weird, crazy idea of how to flip the problem 180. And then all of a sudden, all this stuff started pouring out. You get a new set of equations that describe market. Yep. They show clearly why you have bubbles and crashes, and you create a bridge to, finance theory, capital asset, pricing model, and so on. And you have a one-to-one unique map, and you can characterize any market in terms of a couple of just key parameters, and then show why even efficient markets will have these persistent mispricings and how it disappears under what conditions. And I was like, so what happened was I was like, this is super fun. This is awesome. And, I went into the economics literature to see well, is this sort of obvious? So I had to go back and to the 60s, to Markowitz and, all the people who developed, the descendants of the capital asset pricing stuff in the 70s and 80s, and read through all these papers. And I was like, that's weird. Roughly 11 Nobel Prizes have been given for theories in which markets don't crash. I'm like, that's kind of weird, because, well, let me just check with my Uber driver. Hey, do you think, markets crash? Of course they crash. What are you talking about? Now, being, of course, well-trained in the scientific method, I realized that was anecdotal data. So I called a Lyft driver. I said, well, do markets crash? Yeah, they crash. I'm like, I think we have a problem here. I'm having fun, obviously, but it was really fascinating. And then I decided this is awesome. I can kind of solve this stuff and write it up. And let me just make this an appendix. I'll say a little bit of the market stuff about why it's, crashes. And then in an appendix, I can sort of tell the story and equations and the mathematics that supports that. And I mentioned that to my editor, and he's like, are you out of your mind? Like you were looking for a digression, a short story to make 2 fun paragraphs to explain an idea, which is a side idea. And it's the 3rd story of 3 stories in a footnote chapter no. And, that's not an appendix. I took that out. And then I committed to myself, okay, well, when I'm done with this book stuff, I will get back to this because this is really fun. And it seems to solve some mysteries that have been out there in economics and finance for a while. And I talked to a couple of economists about it. I live in Cambridge, so it's like you go to the cafe, you'll bump into 3 economists. But I have some family friends who are well-known economists, and chatted with them, and they offered to help a few things. And anyway, I thought the book. I didn't really know about how books work. I was like, well, I'm done with writing, so I'm all done, right? No. Your job is just beginning. So it was like, really? Because I have to build a website? I didn't have a website. I didn't have any social media. Like, that's how all this stuff works nowadays. And your publisher's like, you really need to do this. Your lit agent's like, you really need to do this. You want to keep going in this stuff? You really need to. It's like, okay, what's a website look like? Anyway, long story short, I ended up taking like a year before I could get back to the every time I would like to try to take a few days. And then, you get these amazing calls from CEOs of movie studios, of media properties. Yeah. And you're like, this is worlds that I didn't know. And they're really fun to learn about. And who knows how long this 15 minutes will last. I had no idea if the book would take off. I was writing stuff that was, made me laugh, and I found kind of fascinating. Patterns between things, but I have no idea if it'll work. And most publishers was like, yeah, books that mix physics, business, and history, that doesn't really work. And I was like, really? Because when you say that in the plural. Could you give me some examples of books that mix physics? Because I'm not really following, when you say that it can't work, But anyway, there was no data points. And so that took off. By the way, digression, since you're in the VC world, I have an old friend who's a VC, and I've had quite a few people come to me who are like, they want to write. And so he had an idea for a book, and he goes to a publisher, and and this is funny. It's like a year later how the world comes around, and he's meeting with this publisher, and he's presenting his idea, and the publisher's like, that's interesting, but maybe you could write it in those, follow the Safi Bahcall archetype. Loonshots. And he happens to be like an old buddy of mine. Like, we were grad students, postdocs together, whatever. And he's like, really? The archetype? What's that? And so now you go from being something nobody thinks has any chance of working to being an archetype. I don't even know what that means or what the guy meant, but yeah, invent a new economic model, solve it with physics techniques, apply business lessons, and mix it in with, do original historical research. Put that all in a wrapper and you're done.
Exactly. Easy.
Yeah. By the way, there's a whole bookshelf. There's a genre. Anyway, I actually totally lost the thread. Where were we?
So when is that coming out? Or is that the first project you're working on? You're doing both in parallel, or?
Oh, no, I'm juggling that in parallel with the strat. This is just real time. I have Evernote's folders on both, but the market one is, it just got more and more interesting as you create a language, or a lot of my initial thoughts from 2 years ago when I first did it were, in hindsight, a little superficial. And so the more I went back into the economics literature, the more I got much more familiar with it, and learned how, to understand. Long story, you had to learn a lot of stuff. I kind of teased out the kind of macro behaviors, bubbles, crashes, excess volatility, the thing that, Bob
Yep.
Shiller won the Nobel Prize for, why is corporate earnings disconnected from volatility in stock prices. And all that has sort of a natural, fairly straightforward, analytically not very hard explanation. And there's kind of fun ways to explain it in simple language, which I've, occasionally do. And I'll certainly do in a popular version.
Cool.
Um, and I was sort of more or less finished with that in kind of April or May, and then said, there are these other mysteries in markets, which you and I were talking about, and you kind of briefly mentioned, like the more micro.
Yeah.
This is sort of the macro. Why are there bubbles and crashes and excess volatility? And then there are these kind of micro puzzles. If you look at the distribution of returns on kind of practical scales, not only daily scales, but minutes, they're absolutely nothing like the Gaussian distributions you would expect from random walks. And, the constant volatility model is very well known to be
Yeah.
not the case in economics and among anybody who works in quantitative finance. But there's no explanation of these kind of, sometimes the word universal is a little overused, and so you have to use that with certain caveats. You see that in many certain behaviors and properties in almost every market, but there are some exceptions. It's not like gravity, where it's pretty much always 1 over r squared. So I've been working on that problem and how you explain those behaviors, which actually required learning a whole different branch of mathematics. So,
And do you
like
think that
before, I had
fits in the same book, or do you think that fits in a separate book of like problems in finance?
no, it's one overall umbrella of a different model for price dynamics in capital markets.
Okay.
And there's the one aspect of that is macro
And one
behaviors, and
is
another
micro.
aspect
Okay, that makes
is kind of
sense.
the kind of the daily jiggling that you see. That's kind of more
Yeah.
micro.
Cool.
So they're different aspects that are under the same umbrella. Anyway, so when you ask kind of what I'm doing, I have a very weird life. I do that, which is a lot of mathematics on the one side, and then I do the business strategy stuff on the other side, and kind of juggle those two.
Yeah, but that diversity is really cool. I mean, and it leads to these, 97 types of digressions we had in this conversation, which I think, like, it used to be that being a Renaissance person or a bit of polymath was actually highly valued. And we live in a world where, if anything, specialization is it tends to be hyper rewarded. And so doing these cross functional analyses that are history and physics and math, etc., like they're far and few between. And yet I think most of the probably most profound and interesting insights probably come from them. And frankly, it's a more interesting way to lead life if you're actually reading books, talking to lots of interesting people. So I actually think even though it's conceived or perceived perhaps by somebody weird, it's probably a very compelling way of living, an intellectually fulfilled life.
Yeah, I honestly, I don't really think about that much. I kind of I agree. But mostly I'm just like, what am I curious about?
Yeah.
Like, what is a really interesting, challenging problem? Where are there patterns that maybe are fresh and other people haven't seen? And how do you tell those patterns? Um, but I think of it as the power of border dweller.
Makes sense.
So, why was I able to write that weird book, Loonshots? Because I'd lived in the academic theoretical physics world. I'd lived in the business world. So there are a lot of people who are in the academic world, but they haven't necessarily
Yeah.
had the experience of running. And then there are a lot of people in the business world, but probably don't know a lot of theoretical physics. And I had some experience on telling stories and storytelling, but not a lot. And so I worked on that.
Sure.
There were sort of conscious ways to improve on that. And so I just found that an interesting, like you say, like your heli skiing or kiteboarding was an interesting challenge. How do you get better at that? And there are ways to train yourself on that.
I do
So
lots
all
of
of
it
those
that
I found.
people may perceive after it's not the only thing I think I do, but yes, I get you.
Yeah, no, I mean, but to your point, there is a certain benefit of having, of crossing borders.
Yeah.
if there's one thing I would have done more as a CEO, it was read more widely outside my industry or my field, because it gives you a lot of interesting, fresh ideas.
So before we set the record for the longest live stream in the history of the multiverse, is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to mention or you'd like to share?
I think we've covered a fair amount.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for joining me. I think we'll circle back over another conversation of like how we ended up like solving for the life partner checklist, reliving our glory days, and another conversation. But thank you for joining me. This is a fascinating conversation, and look forward to.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming.